On the evening of June 22, 1983, a cashier at a Safeway supermarket in Alexandria, Virginia, noticed something that would eventually unravel one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence operations ever conducted on American soil. Her name was Carol Dennison. She was 28 years old, a single mother working the evening shift to make ends meet, and she had absolutely no training in counterintelligence, no background in espionage, and no reason to suspect that the man buying groceries in her checkout lane that night was anything other than what he appeared to be. A quiet, middle-aged customer who came in every Tuesday evening around 7:30 to purchase the same modest selection of items. But Carol Dennison had something that no amount of training could provide. She had an exceptional memory for faces and patterns, and she had been watching people long enough to know when something didn't quite fit. The man's name, according to the credit card he used, was Thomas Edward Keller. He lived in a townhouse in the Shirlington neighborhood, worked as an insurance adjuster, drove a 7-year-old Honda Accord, and by all appearances had settled into the comfortable anonymity of suburban American life. His neighbors would later tell FBI investigators that he was pleasant but private, helpful in small ways like taking in packages or offering to jumpstart dead batteries, but never particularly social. He attended community association meetings occasionally, voted in local elections, subscribed to the Washington Post, and displayed no interests or behaviors that would mark him as anything other than an ordinary, somewhat boring middle-aged bachelor trying to get through life without making waves. But Thomas Edward Keller was not who he claimed to be. His real name was Dmitry Volkov, and he was a Soviet illegal, a deep-cover intelligence officer who had been living in the United States since 1976, nearly 7 years by the time Carol Dennison first noticed something unusual about him. He had been trained by the KGB's first chief directorate at their facility outside Moscow, spending 3 years learning not just tradecraft and communications protocols, but how to think like an American, how to move through American society without triggering the subtle alarm bells that mark someone as foreign or out of place. He'd studied American sports, American television shows, American political debates, the rhythms of American speech, the casual cynicism that characterized post-Vietnam, post-Watergate America. He'd learned to tell jokes about the DMV and complain about gas prices and make small talk about the weather in exactly the way a real insurance adjuster from Falls Church might do. The legend that had been constructed for him was nearly perfect. Thomas Edward Keller had been born, according to his documents, in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania in 1941. He'd attended public schools, graduated from a state university with a degree in business administration, worked for several insurance companies across the mid-Atlantic region, gotten married briefly in his late 20s, divorced without children, and eventually settled in Northern Virginia, where the insurance industry offered steady work, and where the proximity to Washington meant that thousands of people moved in and out of the area constantly, making it easier for someone to blend in without accumulating the kind of deep social roots that might expose inconsistencies in their background. The real Thomas Edward Keller had existed. He'd been born in Harrisburg in 1941, had attended those schools, and had even worked briefly in insurance. But he died in a drowning accident in 1974 while on vacation in Florida, and Soviet intelligence had simply resurrected him, aging him appropriately and filling in the years since with carefully crafted documentation that would withstand all but the most intensive scrutiny. It was a technique they'd perfected over decades, identifying Americans who died young and in circumstances that made body recovery impossible, or where death certificates existed but attracted little attention, then building entire lives on top of those stolen identities. What made Volkov particularly valuable to the KGB was not just the quality of his cover, but his operational discipline and his specific intelligence-gathering mission. He wasn't targeting nuclear secrets or military installations. He was doing something far more subtle and, in some ways, more valuable. Through his work as an insurance adjuster, he had legitimate reasons to visit businesses, to review financial records, to ask questions about operations and personnel. And many of the businesses he dealt with had contracts with the Department of Defense, with intelligence agencies, with aerospace firms and telecommunications companies that handled classified work. He wasn't trying to steal documents or recruit agents. He was building what intelligence services call a pattern of life assessment, creating detailed maps of how American defense contractors operated, who worked where, what their financial pressures were, which employees might be vulnerable to recruitment, which facilities had lax security, which companies were struggling and might cut corners on background checks. The intelligence he provided to his handlers was maddeningly comprehensive and almost impossible to trace to a single source. He would photograph business directories, noting names and titles. He would document security procedures, observing whether guards checked IDs carefully or waved familiar faces through. He would gather information about employee morale by chatting with secretaries and maintenance workers, the kind of people who knew everything about a company but were rarely considered security risks. He would note which restaurants near defense facilities were popular with employees, which bars they frequented after work, where they socialized and let their guards down. All of this information, transmitted to Moscow through a dead drop system that he serviced once every 6 weeks, helped Soviet intelligence build a remarkably complete picture of the human terrain surrounding America's most sensitive programs. His tradecraft was exceptional. He never visited the Soviet embassy. He maintained no contact with known intelligence officers. His dead drops were elegantly simple, locations that required no suspicious behavior to service. A hollow tree in a jogging path he used 3 times a week. A magnetic container attached to the underside of a park bench in a cemetery, where he occasionally visited to maintain his cover as someone interested in Civil War history. A loose brick in a wall near a metro station where thousands of commuters passed daily. The system was designed with multiple layers of security. Even if one dead drop was compromised, even if surveillance teams were watching, there would be no obvious exchange, no person-to-person contact, nothing that would definitively prove espionage rather than innocent activity. Carol Dennison had been working at the Safeway for 3 years by the summer of 1983. It was her second job. During the day, she worked as a receptionist at a dental office, answering phones and managing appointments. The evening shift at Safeway, Tuesday through Thursday, from 4 o'clock to 10 o'clock, provided the additional income she needed to support herself and her 6-year-old daughter, Emily. The work was repetitive and exhausting, standing for hours scanning groceries and making small talk with customers who were usually tired and impatient after their own long days. But Carol was good at it. She was fast, accurate, and possessed what her manager called an unusual gift for customer service. She remembered regulars, asked about their families, noticed when someone who usually bought name-brand products switched to generic, which might mean financial trouble, or when someone who normally came in alone started buying groceries for 2, which might mean a new relationship. She noticed patterns because noticing patterns was how she made sense of the world. It was how she'd survived a difficult childhood and an early marriage that had ended badly. Paying attention to small changes in behavior, in mood, in routine had been a survival skill, and it had become so ingrained that she did it automatically, cataloging information without consciously deciding to. Thomas Keller had started shopping at the Safeway in late 1982, and by the spring of 1983, Carol had developed a clear picture of his habits. He came in every Tuesday evening between 7:15 and 7:45. He never came any other day of the week. He always bought similar items, basic staples that suggested someone cooking simple meals for one: ground beef, chicken breasts, frozen vegetables, pasta, bread, milk, eggs, coffee. He never bought anything unusual, never splurged on expensive cuts of meat or gourmet items, never bought alcohol beyond an occasional six-pack of domestic beer. He paid with a Visa card, always the same card, and he was unfailingly polite but brief in his interactions, offering a quiet thank you and a small smile, but never engaging in the kind of extended small talk that many customers seemed to crave. There was nothing obviously suspicious about any of this. Plenty of customers had regular shopping routines. Plenty of people lived simple, predictable lives. But something about Thomas Keller bothered Carol in a way she couldn't initially articulate. It wasn't what he did, it was how he did it. The routine was too perfect, too unchanging. Real people, even people with structured lives, showed variation. They forgot items and came back for them. They tried new products. They responded to sales and seasonal changes. They came in at slightly different times depending on traffic or work schedules. Thomas Keller's shopping trips were nearly identical week after week, and that consistency, that complete lack of spontaneity, struck Carol as performative, as if he were following a script rather than simply living his life. The incident that would eventually lead to his exposure occurred on June 22, 1983, a Tuesday evening that started like any other. The store was moderately busy, the usual mix of people stopping in after work to pick up ingredients for dinner or to restock basics before the week progressed too far. Carol was working Register 3, her usual station, and at approximately 7:32, Thomas Keller entered her checkout lane with his cart. The items were typical: a package of ground beef, a box of spaghetti, a jar of marinara sauce, a head of lettuce, a carton of milk, a dozen eggs. Carol began scanning them, making the small talk that was expected. She asked how his evening was going. He said fine, thank you, and yours. She said it was going well, busy but not too bad. The exchange was pleasant and meaningless, the kind of interaction that happened thousands of times a day in grocery stores across America. But then, as Carol scanned the carton of milk, something happened that broke the pattern. The price that came up on the register was wrong. The milk was marked at $1.89, but it rang up at $2.29. It was a common enough problem, a discrepancy between the shelf price and the computer system, usually caused by someone failing to update the database when prices changed. Carol apologized, told him she'd need to do a price check, and called for a manager over the intercom. Thomas Keller's reaction was what caught her attention. For just a fraction of a second, his expression changed. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was something else. Concern, maybe, or calculation. His eyes moved quickly, scanning the store, noting who was nearby, where the exits were, before settling back into the pleasant, patient expression he'd been wearing moments before. The entire sequence took perhaps 2 seconds, but it was enough that Carol noticed. And once she'd noticed, she found herself watching him more, carefully. The manager, a young man named Brad, who'd been with the store for less than a year, arrived and confirmed that the shelf price was $1.89. He manually adjusted the charge, apologized for the inconvenience, and went back to whatever he'd been doing. The transaction continued. Thomas Keller paid with his Visa card, took his receipt, thanked Carol, and left the store. The whole incident should have ended there. But Carol couldn't stop thinking about that momentary change in his expression, that flash of alertness that seemed disproportionate to a simple price discrepancy. She found herself replaying the interaction in her mind during the rest of her shift, trying to understand what had bothered her about it. Over the next several weeks, Carol began paying closer attention to Thomas Keller during his Tuesday evening visits. She noticed things she'd never consciously registered before. He always parked in the same general area of the parking lot, never right up front even when spaces were available, but always in a spot that gave him a clear view of the store entrance. He never wore clothing with logos or distinctive patterns, always solid colors that wouldn't be memorable. He never bought items that were on special promotion, even when they were products he regularly purchased, as if he were deliberately avoiding anything that might require him to vary his routine or interact with store employees beyond the checkout process. And then there was his credit card. Carol had processed thousands of credit card transactions, and she'd developed an unconscious sense for how people handled their cards. Most people kept them in wallets, pulled them out, handed them over, or inserted them into the reader with the casual familiarity of someone performing an action they'd done thousands of times. Thomas Keller handled his credit card differently. He always kept it in his front right pocket, separate from a wallet. He always pulled it out with a specific, deliberate motion. And he always watched the card carefully from the moment it left his pocket until it was back in his possession, as if it were something more valuable than a simple piece of plastic. By mid-July, Carol had convinced herself that something was off about Thomas Keller. She didn't know what, couldn't articulate it in any way that would sound rational or serious, but the feeling persisted. She mentioned it once to Brad, the manager, saying she thought one of the regular customers seemed a little strange. Brad had laughed and said half their customers were strange, that it went with the territory of working retail, and that as long as the guy wasn't causing problems, it wasn't really their concern. She thought about calling the police. But what would she say? That a customer made her uncomfortable because he was too consistent in his shopping habits? That he'd seemed momentarily tense during a price check? It sounded ridiculous even in her own mind. She was a grocery store, cashier with no evidence of anything beyond a vague feeling that something wasn't right. But Carol Dennison had another skill beyond pattern recognition. She had stubbornness. Once she'd identified something as a problem, she couldn't let it go. And so she began conducting her own quiet investigation, limited though it was by her resources and position. She started keeping a notebook, a small spiral-bound pad that she kept in her purse. After each of Thomas Keller's visits, she would go to her car during her break and write down everything she could remember. The time he arrived, what he bought, what he was wearing, anything unusual about his behavior. She noted whether he seemed more alert than usual, whether he glanced at other customers or avoided them, whether his routine varied in any way. The notebook became a detailed log of his Tuesday evening shopping trips, and as the pages filled, certain patterns became even clearer. He never ever shopped on any day except Tuesday. She'd started paying attention to the parking lot on other evenings, looking for his Honda Accord, and it was never there. She'd asked other cashiers if they'd ever seen him, describing him carefully, and none of them recognized him. His shopping was exclusively confined to Tuesday evenings, exclusively in the window between 7:15 and 7:45, exclusively at her store rather than any of the other Safeways in the area. That kind of rigid adherence to schedule suggested to Carol that the shopping itself wasn't really about buying groceries. It was about something else. Maintaining a pattern of normal behavior. Establishing a routine that would explain his presence in the area at a specific time. Creating an alibi. In early August, Carol made a decision that would change everything. She decided to follow Thomas Keller after he left the store. She knew it was probably foolish, possibly dangerous, and definitely outside any reasonable boundary of what a grocery store cashier should be doing. But she'd reached a point where the not knowing was worse than the risk. On Tuesday, August 9th, Carol asked Brad if she could take her dinner break immediately after Thomas Keller's expected arrival time. Brad agreed, not thinking anything of it. At 7:34, Thomas Keller came through her checkout lane with his usual items. Carol processed the transaction, watched him leave, then immediately grabbed her purse and followed him out of the store. She'd parked her car, a rusty Plymouth Volare that burned oil and needed brake work, in a position where she could see the section of the parking lot where Thomas Keller typically parked. She reached her car just as his Honda Accord was pulling out onto the main road. She started her engine and followed, staying back far enough that she hoped he wouldn't notice her, but close enough that she wouldn't lose him in traffic. The drive lasted approximately 12 minutes. Thomas Keller headed south on Route 1, then turned into a residential neighborhood of modest townhouses and garden apartments. He parked on the street in front of a beige townhouse unit, got out with his groceries, and went inside. Carol drove past slowly, noting the address, then circled the block and parked where she could observe his unit without being too obvious. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Lights came on inside the townhouse. Through the front window, Carol could see movement, someone putting away groceries, the ordinary domestic activity of someone arriving home. Then, at approximately 8:20, Thomas Keller emerged from his townhouse. But he wasn't wearing the same clothes he'd had on in the grocery store. He'd changed into dark pants and a dark jacket, and he was carrying nothing. No briefcase, no bag, nothing that would indicate where he was going or what he planned to do. He got into his Honda and drove away. Carol, her heart pounding now with a mixture of fear and excitement, followed. This time, the drive was longer, more circuitous. Thomas Keller seemed to be taking a route designed to detect surveillance, making unexpected turns, varying his speed, pulling into parking lots and then exiting them. Carol tried to stay back, tried to be invisible in traffic, and somehow managed to keep him in sight. After nearly 30 minutes of this pattern, Thomas Keller pulled into Rock Creek Park, one of the large federal parks that cut through Washington, D.C. It was approaching dusk, that liminal time when day shifts to night, and the park was largely empty. Carol followed at a distance, watching as Thomas Keller parked near a picnic area and got out of his car. This was the moment when Carol should have turned around and gone home. Should have realized that whatever she'd stumbled onto was beyond her capability to investigate safely. But she'd come this far, and she needed to know. She parked her car several hundred feet away, in a spot partially obscured by trees, and watched. Thomas Keller walked into the park, following a jogging trail that curved away from the parking area. Carol waited 2 minutes, then followed on foot, staying far enough back that she could barely see him, moving from tree to tree like someone playing a child's game of hide-and-seek. Thomas Keller stopped at a section of the trail where a Civil War memorial marker stood, one of dozens scattered throughout the park. He glanced around, a quick but thorough scan of his surroundings, and then he knelt beside a low stone wall that bordered the marker. His hands moved quickly, and Carol couldn't see exactly what he was doing from her position. But after perhaps 10 seconds, he stood up and walked briskly back toward the parking lot. Carol remained hidden until she heard his car start and drive away. Then she approached the memorial marker, her hands shaking, and examined the stone wall. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just old stone and mortar and the accumulated dirt of decades. But then she noticed a brick that sat slightly different from the others, pushed in just a fraction of an inch more than it should be. She worked it loose, and behind it, in a hollow space, was a small waterproof container. Carol stood there for a long moment, holding the container, understanding with absolute clarity that she had just found something that was absolutely none of her business and absolutely dangerous. She could open it, look inside, confirm whatever suspicion had been building. Or she could put it back, leave it alone, walk away, and forget this had ever happened. She opened it. Inside was a roll of film, the kind used in 35mm cameras, and a folded piece of paper covered in what appeared to be typed numbers and letters in groups that made no sense. It was clearly some kind of code, and the film almost certainly contained photographs of something that Thomas Keller had access to, something he was passing to whoever serviced this dead drop. Carol's hands were shaking so badly now that she nearly dropped the container. She carefully placed everything back inside, returned it to the hollow space behind the brick, repositioned the brick, and walked as calmly as she could manage back to her car. She sat in the Plymouth for 15 minutes, trying to decide what to do. She could go home, pretend she'd never followed him, never found the dead drop, never confirmed that Thomas Keller was engaged in something that looked exactly like espionage. Or she could report what she'd found to someone, somehow, and deal with whatever consequences followed. Carol Dennison drove directly to the nearest police station, a small Arlington County facility that handled local matters. She walked in at approximately 9:15 in the evening and told the duty officer that she needed to report something related to possible espionage. The officer, a sergeant named Michael Torres, looked at her with the practiced skepticism of someone who'd heard a lot of strange stories from civilians over the years. But Carol's account was specific, detailed, and presented with enough nervous sincerity that Torres didn't dismiss it outright. He took her statement, writing down the address of Thomas Keller's townhouse, the location of the dead drop in Rock Creek Park, and Carol's description of her observations over the previous 2 months. When she finished, Torres told her he would forward the information to the appropriate authorities, and that she should go home and not discuss this with anyone. The report sat on Torres's desk for 2 days before he decided to pass it along to the FBI's Washington field office. Counterintelligence cases were not handled by local police, and while Torres wasn't sure the grocery store cashier's story amounted to anything, it had enough specificity that he thought it warranted a federal look. The FBI agent who received the report was named Jennifer Castillo, a 7-year veteran of the Bureau who worked in the counterintelligence division. She'd spent the previous 3 years tracking Soviet intelligence activities in the Washington area, and she'd seen enough legitimate cases to know that sometimes the most important tips came from the most unlikely sources. A grocery store cashier reporting suspicious behavior from a regular customer might sound absurd, but the details of Carol's observations, particularly the dead drop location and the disciplined routine, matched patterns that professional intelligence officers used. On August 15, 1983, Jennifer Castillo called Carol Dennison at home and asked if they could meet. Carol agreed, and that afternoon, sitting in Carol's small apartment in Arlington while Emily watched television in the other room, Jennifer listened to the entire story again. She asked detailed questions about Thomas Keller's behavior, about the credit card he used, about his shopping patterns, and the route he'd taken to the park. She asked Carol to describe exactly what she'd seen at the dead drop site, and exactly what had been inside the waterproof container. When Carol finished, Jennifer was silent for a long moment. Then she told Carol that what she'd stumbled onto was potentially very serious, that it would require further investigation, and that Carol needed to continue her normal routine exactly as before. She should not follow Thomas Keller again, should not visit the dead drop site again, should not alter her behavior at work in any way that might alert him that something had changed. If Thomas Keller was what Jennifer suspected he might be, he would be trained to notice even subtle shifts in the people around him, and any indication that he was under observation could cause him to disappear. The FBI moved quickly, but carefully. Within 48 hours, they had established surveillance on Thomas Edward Keller. They verified his address, ran his credit history, pulled his employment records, and began the methodical process of determining whether he was actually an insurance adjuster living an ordinary life, or whether Carol Dennison's instincts had been correct. What they found was a background that seemed legitimate, but contained tiny fractures when examined closely enough. Thomas Edward Keller's college transcripts showed him attending classes that hadn't been offered in the semesters indicated. His Social Security number was real, but the earliest tax records they could find for him dated to 1976, with nothing before that, despite the fact that he would have been in his mid-30s by then. A former supervisor at an insurance company he claimed to have worked for in the early 70s had no memory of him at all. Each inconsistency was small enough to be explained by clerical error or faulty record-keeping. But together, they suggested something more deliberate. A constructed identity built on top of a stolen foundation. The FBI also placed the Rock Creek Park dead drop site under surveillance. Using long-range cameras and concealed observation posts, they watched the memorial marker continuously on August 23rd, 8 days after Carol's meeting with Jennifer Castillo. Someone serviced the drop. A man in jogging clothes ran past the memorial marker, paused briefly as if catching his breath, knelt to tie his shoe, and in those few seconds retrieved the container from behind the brick and replaced it with another one. The entire exchange took less than 30 seconds, and someone not watching carefully would never have noticed it happened at all. The FBI photographed the courier, ran his image through every database they had, and identified him as someone they'd been watching for over a year. Alexei Petrov, a cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy, which meant he was almost certainly an intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover. The connection between Thomas Keller and the Soviet embassy, mediated through a dead drop in a public park, was exactly the pattern that characterized a Soviet illegal running an active intelligence operation. The decision was made at the highest levels of the FBI to move forward with arrest rather than continuing surveillance. The risk that Keller might detect the investigation and flee was too great, and the potential intelligence value of catching him with evidence before he could destroy it outweighed the benefit of watching the operation continue. On the morning of September 7th, 1983, at approximately 6:00 a.m., FBI agents executed arrest and search warrants at Thomas Keller's townhouse. Keller was taken into custody as he was preparing to leave for work, offered no resistance, and immediately invoked his right to remain silent. The search of his townhouse produced evidence that confirmed what the FBI had suspected. Hidden in a false panel in his bedroom closet, agents found a Minox camera, several rolls of undeveloped film, a one-time pad for encoding and decoding messages, and a Soviet passport in the name Dmitry Volkov. They also found detailed notes about defense contractors, personnel rosters, facility layouts, and security procedures. The information represented years of patient intelligence gathering, the kind of foundational work that would allow Soviet intelligence to identify vulnerabilities and plan future operations. At the same time, Keller was being arrested. FBI agents also arrested Alexei Petrov at his apartment in Georgetown, Petrov immediately claimed diplomatic immunity and refused to cooperate with investigators. The State Department, after consultation with the White House, declared him persona non grata and expelled him from the country within 72 hours. He was never prosecuted, simply sent back to the Soviet Union with the understanding that his intelligence career in the United States was permanently over. Thomas Edward Keller, or rather Dmitry Volkov, faced a different fate. Without diplomatic protection, he was charged with multiple counts of espionage under the Espionage Act. His trial began in January 1984 in federal court, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The physical materials found in his home, the surveillance footage of the dead drop operation, and the analysis of the documents he'd been photographing all painted a clear picture of a Soviet intelligence officer who had been successfully operating under deep cover for nearly 7 years. The trial lasted 4 weeks, and on February 14, 1984, Dmitry Volkov was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. During the sentencing hearing, he spoke publicly for the first time since his arrest, addressing the judge in heavily accented English and stating simply that he had been serving his country just as American intelligence officers served theirs, and that he regretted nothing except that he had been caught. Carol Denison's role in the case was kept classified for several years. The FBI didn't want to expose the fact that their investigation had been initiated by a grocery store cashier's observations, partly because it might discourage other Soviet illegals from maintaining the kind of routine behavior that had made Volkov detectable, and partly because they wanted to protect Carol from any potential retaliation. She continued working at the Safeway, continued raising her daughter, and tried to return to the ordinary life she'd been living before Thomas Keller had become something more than just a regular customer. But the case had changed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She'd discovered that she had instincts that went beyond simple pattern recognition, that her ability to notice inconsistencies and trust her judgment about people had value in contexts she'd never imagined. In 1985, at the suggestion of Jennifer Castillo, who had stayed in touch with her, Carol applied for a position with the FBI as an intelligence analyst. She was accepted, completed training, and began a career that would last more than 20 years, working in counterintelligence and eventually becoming one of the Bureau's most skilled analysts for identifying illegals operating in the United States. Dmitry Volkov served 12 years of his sentence before being released as part of a prisoner exchange in 1996, traded for an American intelligence officer who had been arrested in Moscow. He returned to Russia and disappeared from Western intelligence awareness. Whether he viewed his time in America as a success or a failure, whether he ever learned that his exposure had begun with a cashier, noticing that he was too consistent in his shopping habits, these are questions that remain unanswered. What is clear is that Carol Denison's observations, her willingness to trust her instincts even when she had no official authority or expertise, led to the disruption of an intelligence operation that had been running successfully for years. The FBI's damage assessment concluded that Volkov had identified numerous potential targets for recruitment, had documented security vulnerabilities at several defense contractor SARN facilities, and had provided Moscow with detailed information about the operational patterns of American counterintelligence in the Washington area. The intelligence he'd gathered hadn't led to immediate catastrophic breaches, but it had given Soviet planners advantages that would have accumulated over time. The case became something of a legend within the FBI's counterintelligence division. A reminder that sometimes the most sophisticated operations could be exposed by the simplest observations. That someone didn't need advanced training or classified access to notice when something was wrong. They just needed to be paying attention. The Safeway, where Carol Denison worked, closed in 1998, replaced by a newer store built a few miles away. The Rock Creek Park memorial marker, where Dmitry Volkov had operated his dead drop, is still there, visited occasionally by history enthusiasts and by FBI agents who use it as a teaching tool when training new counterintelligence officers. There's no plaque or marker indicating what happened there, nothing to suggest that this quiet spot in a public park was once the link in a chain that connected a Soviet illegal to his handlers in Moscow. For Carol Dennison, who retired from the FBI in 2007 and now lives quietly in North Carolina with her daughter Emily and 3 grandchildren, the case remains the defining moment of her professional life. She's spoken about it occasionally at FBI training sessions, telling new analysts that the most important skill in intelligence work isn't technical knowledge or access to classified systems. It's the ability to notice when patterns break, when someone's behavior doesn't quite match their stated identity, when something that should be random becomes too consistent to be natural. Because in the end, that's what had exposed Dmitry Volkov. Not sophisticated surveillance technology or penetration of Soviet communications, just a grocery store cashier who noticed that a customer's shopping routine was too perfect, too unchanging, too much like a performance rather than a life. And who trusted that observation enough to act on it, even when doing so seemed unreasonable and possibly dangerous? The lesson, if there is one, is that the machinery of intelligence and counterintelligence, for all its sophistication and resources, sometimes depends on the instincts of ordinary people. People who work checkout lanes and notice small inconsistencies. People who trust their judgment even when they have no official standing to do so. People who understand that something can be wrong even when you can't immediately articulate why. Dmitry Volkov was a trained intelligence officer, skilled in tradecraft, disciplined in his operational security, and supported by one of the most effective intelligence services in the world. But his downfall came because he made his routine too perfect, and because someone happened to be paying attention.